Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening and welcome to Woman. Tonight is the second of our two programs devoted to childbirth. My guests are Dr. Sumner Yaffe, who is chairperson of the Committee on Drugs for the American Academy of Pediatrics. He is also professor of pediatrics at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Dr. Yaffe is director of the Division of Pharmacology at Children's Hospital in Buffalo. Joining us again is Doris Haire. Doris is a member of the National Institute of Health Committee on the Prevention of Fetal and Perinatal Disease and a member of the American Public Health Committee on Maternal Health Care and Family Planning. She's also the author of The Cultural Warping of Childbirth, which has been translated into several languages. Welcome to both of you. Dr. Yaffe, what is the current thinking on prescribing drugs to pregnant women?
I think there's been a change in our thinking over the years as physicians have become aware of the hazards that may be associated to the fetus and infant by prescribing drugs to the pregnant women. So that I think that fewer drugs are being prescribed than previously, but in my opinion at least, perhaps still too many drugs are being prescribed.
Why is that? Is that because we always felt that the placenta was immune?
Well, that's an old idea which has recently, within the last 10 years or so, been shown not to be true. And I think that it's fairly safe to say that all drugs given to the mother will cross the placenta and affect the fetus.
Are drugs linked to birth defects?
A few drugs are definitely linked to birth defects. Then there are a large number of drugs where a causal relationship has not been established. The reasons for this are rather lengthy and would probably take more than the time available to us, but part of this lies in the fact that many drugs perhaps produce defects which are common, and they're not unique in the defects which they produce. An example of a drug which did produce a striking defect, which has revolutionized our thinking about using drugs in pregnant women, is thalidomide, which was a drug which was introduced in Europe, in Germany and Great Britain in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and even in Canada, but was not introduced in this country. This drug produced a striking, tragic malformation with abnormalities of the arms and legs in many thousands of infants whose mothers received this drug, which was used as a sort of tranquilizer, a sedative in the women during pregnancy to make them sleep better. And as a consequence of the tragedy which occurred, which was averted in this country because the drug was never introduced and approved in this country, the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act was changed in 1962 in this country. The changes which resulted required that drugs which were to be approved must have a demonstration of both safety, which had been required before, but also beneficial effect or efficacy. They had to be effective. And furthermore, drugs had to be evaluated in situations in which they would be used. So that, for example, a drug that would be used in children or in pregnant women would have to be indeed evaluated in this group. You couldn't use data from, let's say, adult men or women and then translate this for use in infants, children, or pregnant women.
Doris, you have strong feelings about the rights of the pregnant mother as to being informed about what drug is being used.
Well, I feel strongly that manufacturers of drugs should publish what would be called in some circles a patient label. And this would be an explanation of the possible hazards of the drugs. I mean, there are always benefits and hazards to any obstetrical medication, or actually in any drug. And my feeling is that whenever a mother takes a drug and she's pregnant, rather, a pregnant woman takes a drug, in a sense, she's playing the game of obstetrical roulette, because the judicious use of obstetrical medication can only be determined after the baby is born. Wouldn't you agree with that?
That's as far as its effect on the baby is concerned.
Yes.
Of course, I mean, the overwhelming indication for the use of drugs during pregnancy, prescribed drugs, is to benefit the mother. I mean, she has some disease or illness, and the obstetrician who's caring for her prescribes a drug. And as we indicated at the beginning of this program, prior thinking was that that was the only part of his concern, and I think that's been drastically changed, and most obstetricians fully realize that the fetus is also a drug recipient. What Mrs. Haire is referring to is that we're not going to know what the beneficial or adverse effects of that drug are upon the fetus who receives the drug in the 3rd month or 6th month until he's born, or indeed due to recent evidence associated with a drug which had been used in pregnancy, diethylstilbestrol, to prevent miscarriage early in pregnancy, and the finding that 15 to 20 years after the drug was used, the offspring of those pregnancies had a very rare form of cancer. So that I think I'm trying to develop the concept. I agree that the effects on the fetus can't be seen until birth, but I would say that one has to look much beyond birth, because obviously using the lesson of diethylstilbestrol, you're going to have to look for a generation later.
Well, how does a doctor deal with this? I mean, a patient is in his office and complaining of a real medical problem or pain or whatever, and he must respond. How does he deal with this?
Well, I think that the prudent physician, as with any drug in any patient, has to weigh the benefit versus the risk. And we're talking about the risk, because I think the benefit to the mother is known. It's the risk which is, has undergone a change in physician thinking. First, it was only the risk to the mother. Now we know it's the risk to the mother and the fetus. The problem is confounded by the fact that we don't know whether adverse effects, let's say, are present or produced by administration of the drug, which maybe won't make themselves noticed until 20 years later. Or you can even extend this further, and I don't think this is far-fetched, maybe the next generation. So you can see that it's going to take a long time to absolutely gather 100% safety data. So that then, with this in mind, that is a big unknown area. The physician now has to take that into consideration in prescribing drugs.
What about vitamins or iron? I mean, are these the exceptions?
Exceptions in terms of being prescribed, I think, from my experience, and I'm not an obstetrician but a pediatrician, I would think that the majority of American women do receive vitamins and iron routinely during pregnancy, because there is a need for increased iron during pregnancy. I think that's a known fact. There is a need for perhaps certain vitamin, an increase in certain vitamins during pregnancy. But I think that one can detect the woman who is anemic by measurement of by taking a blood sample, as she's seen in the physician's office receiving care during pregnancy, and then prescribe iron if this is necessary. I object to the routine prescription, in a certain sense, to prevent iron deficiency, which doesn't occur in all women. The same is true for vitamins. I think that if a person is on a well-balanced diet, then there probably is no need for vitamin supplementation or prescribing of vitamins.
Go ahead, Doris.
One of the things, it's an unfortunate side effect of the thalidomide problem, which I'm just beginning to understand when I talk to mothers, and that's just that because thalidomide was so highly discussed in this country, and because thalidomide was not allowed to be on the market in our country, it has created the illusion of safety. Women, because thalidomide was not allowed, women tend to feel that any drug that is unsafe would not be allowed. And so that we've been lulled into a sense of safety that really doesn't exist. And as the Committee on Drugs made a statement not too long ago in Pediatrics.
Dr. Yaffe's committee?
Yes. Oh, I follow everything he writes. That anyway, it was something to the effect that there is no drug, whether food additive, over-the-counter, or prescription, which has been proven safe for the unborn child.
I would, well, since we wrote the statement, I have to agree with it. But
I don't think that was verbatim, but you might...
Wait,
no,
do you
I
want to
don't
qualify that?
I think that what Mrs. Haire is referring to has to do also with the change in thinking that's occurred about safety. Thalidomide really shocked us and shocked the world as well. While prior to 1962 or 60, we were more complacent, so what we required for safety was, as I indicated, directed toward safety in, let's say, the adult population. There were no requirements that safety be demonstrated in pregnant women. And it was only in 1962, with the amendments to the Food and Drug Act, that these requirements were made statutory, were made law. As a consequence now, it is true that a drug which would be introduced into the market would have to go through an approval process by the FDA, and if this drug had a use in a pregnant woman, studies would have to be performed in pregnant women, not in pregnant animals either, because I think it's quite clear that one cannot readily transfer information from animals, any number of animal species, to man. I think we're unique, and one has to do this in pregnant women. Now, this is an extremely difficult situation where we're concerned about the hazards from drugs which are on the market, approved prior to these changed food and drug laws, 1962. And now to take a new drug, which is being readied for approval, and to test this in pregnant women, many physicians are loath to do this. So that as a consequence, you find that these drugs are marketed and approved with a sort of disclaimer clause. And it says that data regarding safety and effectiveness are not available for use during pregnancy, or for that matter, in infants and children. As a pediatrician, I'm also concerned with the infant and child after birth, and that means that in a legal sense, these drugs are not available for use in this population. The term has been coined that they're orphaned for use. Now, that doesn't prevent a physician, because the drug is on the market, from using this drug, because this
Does that mean that the pregnant woman should refuse to take that drug?
Well, I think that the physician should inform the woman of the status of that drug. That is, that this drug has been marketed, it's approved, but we don't know anything about its safety in pregnant women.
I would like to make a suggestion.
Okay.
And that is that I think that a woman, before she takes any drug, whether it's that she should ask the pharmacist for a package insert sheet. And I asked my own druggist for this package insert sheet, and he said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Haire, but I can't give you the package insert sheet. That's against pharmaceutical ethics." And I said, "Is that a regulation or is that an opinion?" And he said, "Oh, it's a regulation." And then I called the state pharmaceutical board and State Board of Pharmacy. And he said, "Oh, Mrs. Haire, that's not a regulation, that's just his opinion." So I called the druggist and I told him that there was no such regulation, and he said, "Oh," and sent out the package insert sheet with the drug. There is a package insert sheet that comes with every drug that's marketed. And if you take there was a PDR, Physician's Desk Reference, which I consider, in my own opinion, I feel it's rather unreliable because there are many potentially dangerous drugs that are which are not even listed in the PDR, such as spartine sulfate, which is used regularly for elective induction in many hospitals, not in all, but in some or many. Anyway, this drug is, if the mother or the expectant mother read the package insert sheet, she would run screaming down the halls. Sounds terrible.
Are there studies that have proven this drug to be dangerous? No.
There are no studies that prove this drug to be safe. And this is my big contention, that I said on the last time I was on the program that I wouldn't be surprised if Demerol or Meperidine or Nicentil, some of the commonly used drugs today, if they attempted to be cleared by the FDA today. You see, most of these drugs that are given to women in our country during pregnancy, labor, birth, and lactation were on the market prior to 1962. But if the drugs that are given to women commonly in this country were put through the tests, or if these manufacturers applied to the FDA today for clearance, it's very unlikely that they would be allowed to come onto the market.
Does your committee have an opinion on some of these drugs? Have they made statements?
Not necessarily on the individual drugs, but we have been actually, our committee has been actually developing guidelines for how to get this information for the FDA. Actually,
well, I would like to know what the FDA does.
With the FDA.
How effective are they? Do
Well,
you feel that they're doing their job?
Right.
They never answer
yes,
their letters?
I think we differ.
Yes,
in
as a member of this committee, NIH committee, I was preparing some work for the committee, and I wrote to the FDA. I waited a month for an answer. I told them that it was important to my work for this NIH committee that I have an answer. I waited a second month, sending in another letter, asking for the information. And after 3 months, I received no answer. Finally, I was clued into the fact that if you want an answer from the FDA, you get it by writing your congressman. After writing a letter to my congressman, I got an answer in 1 week. But I have since written letters to the FDA, and 6 months have gone by, but I've given up. They just
I think
tend not to answer.
That's sort of an unfortunate set of circumstances that you didn't get an answer, because I think that you shouldn't have to write to your congressman to, as a consumer and citizen of this country, to get an answer from a government agency. I'd like to back up a minute, if I could, and perhaps explain what the Committee on Drugs is trying to do, and some of the terms which Mrs. Haire used before, like package insert, what that means, and what the PDR is, and then also an interesting term which he introduced, and that is a patient package insert, which is something that has really just come into being and may be a very useful educational device for consumers of drugs, and pregnant women are the topic of the consumer for today. The package insert is in legal terms, the label of the, it describes all of the indications that are approved and all of the hazards that are associated with the use of the drug. This package insert has to be approved by the FDA. It's developed by the company usually, and the FDA working in concert. And there's been a marked improvement in quality of package inserts over the years, and I think they're very substantial and authoritative documents, the ones that are approved today.
I don't think Mrs. Haire agrees with you.
Now, the PDR, Physician's Desk Reference, is really a compilation of package inserts. I mean, the approved labels on drugs, and they're just put into a book, and they're verbatim. with what you find that accompanies each drug package that's in the pharmacist's hands, and which he then dispenses to the patient and removes the package insert, because that's the physician's information and his information.
Why should there be a difference between the patient's information and the physician's?
I haven't come to
Okay.
to that part yet. Well, recently, and I either was in the late fall or early winter, the FDA for the first time insisted that a manufacturer with one drug product prepare a patient sort of package insert, which is what you're asking, which it would only differ in terms of the language, so that the language would be more meaningful and understandable by someone who hadn't gone to medical school. But it stated the facts, and I think this could be a useful device, for example, for those drugs where safety has not been demonstrated, to sort of have this given to patients when they get a prescription drug. It would also give you the side effects, which are common with a lot of drugs. It would also tell you what drugs not to take with this. It would tell you when to take it, that is before meals, after meals. Often physicians neglect this information, and sometimes pharmacists, who should be doing this too, don't tell you.
We have to let Mrs. Haire interrupt here. She's having
Well, I think that when you look at the package insert sheets, much of the wording is evasive. They tend to use the word overdosage, and yet they never give you a specific amount of the drug which would be considered an overdosage. And the language I consider, such as Demerol, to me is a very evasive wording. It's
not evasive, because the problem is you're trying to design a package insert for all people, and that's impossible. What we're learning about drugs today, and I must say that everything that's has been made possible by improvements in methodology and the ability to study patients, to measure levels of drugs, to measure side effects of drugs and positive effects of drugs. This is all within the past, let's say, certainly within the past 10 years. And there's no question that an overdose for you may be an underdose for me. What I'm saying is there's such a variation between patients in the way they handle drugs, so that therefore one should alter the dose.
Let's get off package inserts, because
Okay.
we don't have all that much time left and we have a lot more to cover. Let's talk about the administration of drugs during labor and what drugs are administered and the effects and so on. For instance, during an episiotomy, a small local anesthesia is administered. Is that harmful, do you feel? Doris?
Well, of course, he's the one who would be more qualified to talk about the harm, but I would just like to say that no one has shown that there is any value to the routine, to a routine episiotomy. To me, this is an irony. I think it's the biggest con operation that was ever pulled on the American woman, that almost 100% of our women have episiotomies, and yet in a country such as the Netherlands or Sweden or Russia, it's between 6 and 10%, and a lot of this, so that I'm very super sensitive.
Well, I agree with the figures which Mrs. Haire stated, and therefore would agree with the statement. So, asking whether or not a local anesthetic, which is used for an unnecessary procedure, is sort of, really begging the issue. And I think she's focused on the real issue, that is whether an episiotomy is necessary or not. In this country, I mean, obstetricians have been doing this procedure, and there's no question that they don't do it.
What are some other procedures? Because we only have about 3 minutes.
Well, now, such as when a mother has a desultory labor, this means when
I don't know what that means.
a very slow labor. It's not effective. In other countries, they would get the mother up and walk her up and down the halls. In our country, someone heads for the hypodermic. So that it's just a whole different approach that we have. We are pharmacologically oriented.
Well, that's right. I was going to say a drug-oriented society, which we are. I mean, the numbers of, I'm not trying to avoid the question about labor and delivery, but in studies which have been done, which sort of tabulate the numbers of drugs which patients take during pregnancy, these will range from 6, let's say, to 14 or 18, as each woman will take 6 to 14 drugs during pregnancy. Many of these also, and we haven't mentioned this before, are over-the-counter preparations which she can obtain herself. And I don't know here that we know anything about the safety of these preparations either. For example, aspirin, which is taken by an enormous number, a large number of women during pregnancy. In fact, a study was published, you know, data like this are hard to come by. A study was published in which approximately 300 deliveries, consecutive deliveries, were surveyed, and blood samples from the umbilical cord were obtained and assayed for aspirin, which you can do in the laboratory. And 30 of these women, 10%, at that time had detectable aspirin levels. That means they had taken an aspirin in the 3 to 6 hours prior to delivery, because otherwise it wouldn't be detectable. The women were asked, have you taken aspirin? And all of them denied it, the 30 that had the 10%. When they then went back and asked trade names, and you know the variety of trade names which is shown on television all the time, yes, they admitted it. And they didn't realize that these products contained aspirin. Now, the difficulty with aspirin, or the adverse effects, are it's been clearly shown that even one aspirin tablet taken in the week prior to delivery will affect the clotting mechanisms in the infant after birth. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, he may develop
We have 30
bleeding.
seconds. Doris, I'm afraid that, you know, perhaps we may have frightened some women away from drugs. Would you want to comment on that?
Well, I think that it's important for all women to
30
realize
seconds.
that there are times when drugs are absolutely essential to the survival of her baby, and that we shouldn't approach this as that no woman should take a drug. There are times when it's extremely important, but it's always a good idea to minimize the use of drugs whenever possible.
Thank you both very much. We've run out of time. Thank you and good night. See you next week.